All right, everyone, welcome in to Talkin' Soccer. I am Justin Horniger, your host. For those of you listening on the podcast, welcome. If you're watching the YouTube live, I appreciate you as well. We got a lot to talk about as we kind of run through what's happened this week in the American soccer world. It's been an eventful week in many fronts, but we're getting back into the swing of games every weekend, which is my time to shine, quite frankly. And not only that, we've got a lot of things going on off the field, as well as getting ready for the NWSL season about to start. And NWSL FIFA ratings are out. I've got some thoughts. I've got some thoughts on that Portland Thorns kit. I've got some thoughts on the Utah Royals coming back into the league. We're also going to talk what's going on in Rochester with that historic franchise, formerly of the USL, formerly of the MLS Next Pro now, and we'll talk a little more about what's going on there, as well as the CONCACAF Champions League. Kicked off this week, we have drama with Haitian club Violet AC upsetting Austin FC, to give you a little spoiler for later on in the pod. And we have a dog on the pitch, which, of course, it doesn't get much better than CONCACAF, folks. And then we'll talk a little bit about upcoming MLS matches and St. Louis City, what I've kind of picked up from this week's training and what they're hopefully looking for against Portland this week. But to get things started, I wanted to roll into the FIFA ratings that came out this week. Of course, NWSL being included in this year's edition of FIFA. Folks, we've been waiting for it. We've been calling for it. And I don't know, a little underwhelmed, I guess. I think it's one of those things where some people who are just NWSL fans that will buy everything NWSL, there are a portion of that fan base that doesn't buy into FIFA at all. So this is maybe a way to touch that fan base. Of course, the women's game being included this year, it's a big step in terms of accessibility, in terms of women being included in a major sporting game franchise. And it's important. I think you can't understate how much of a big deal this is. Obviously, from a gameplay standpoint, I doubt anyone that currently plays FIFA is going to play the women's mode. I'm sure there will be some, but it's not like they're marketing this as a mode to increase current gamers' game time or whatever. But I think there are a lot of people that are very much looking forward to them being included in the game. And now we get to discuss some real boneheaded ratings and missed opportunities as we look into this rating system. Sophia Smith already. Let's look at the top 10 overall rankings of the NWSL in FIFA this year. Alex Morgan leads the way with a 90 overall, followed by Dabinia at 88, Sophia Smith at 87, Mallory Swanson at 87, Rose Lavelle at 87, Megan Rapinoe at 86, which is bold if you ask me. Kristen Press at 86, again, bold. Becky Sauerbrunn at 86, Alyssa Nair at 85, Kaylin Sheridan, Adriana Franch at 85, which is cool. I like seeing, I think if there's one thing that NWSL is known for, it's having strong goalkeeper play. So I like seeing Nair, Sheridan, Franch, Bella Bixby, Jaden Campbell, Aubrey Kingsbury, and then going down a little bit further, Casey Murphy as well, which I think, given Casey Murphy's performance with the national team this year, that's probably a little bit low, having her at 83, but a good rating for her nonetheless. So you can kind of see, if you're watching the live right now, we're kind of scrolling up and down some, big names that probably should be ranked higher. Crystal Dunn as an 84, Yuki Nakasato as an 84, and then if you go, what interests me as someone who lives in KC, as someone who covers the Current, is going in, if you actually go to ea.com, game/FIFA, you can look at all the FIFA ratings and you can, look at your own team. So if I wanted to go in and I want to look at specifically Kansas City Current, which is what I do, so I can give you some real insight to how bogus some of these ratings are. And I think, you have that with any FIFA game. It's ratings don't equal performance on the field, and things that a player is really good at aren't necessarily going to make for a high rating, and especially if a lot of their success on the field is about manager usage, that's not going to show up in a video game either. So for the Kansas City Current, of course, Dabina leading the way. That's why you pay her that big contract. Number 2 in the NWSL, though, which is big, because I think Dabina doesn't get her due credit a lot just because of her past MVPs and just kind of seen as beyond it now, but she's still in the prime of her career. Edie Franch at 85, Desi Scott at 84, and this is where we get into, I think, some very underrated players in this KC Current roster. Samuel is still an 82, even though she hasn't played in a year and a half. Vanessa DiBernardo at 82. Haley Mace at 82. I think Haley Mace could maybe be higher. Lola Bonta at 81. Elizabeth Ball. Morgan Gautrat. Claire Lavage is 77. I think the biggest one for me here is, and it doesn't even show up on the main page here, but Alex Loera should be much, much higher in this list. I think she's rated a 74. And that is a player who was very, very important to the overall Kansas City Current run last year. And I think there's a lot of discounting with her defensive skills and her ability to step into the midfield as well. But again, that probably goes more to usage and versatility than raw stats. It's dumb, but it is what it is. They're in the game, and that's all we can really ask for in the game, much like the Portland Thorns kit, which does appear, will it make the game? Will it be in the game in time? We need to talk about this kit, folks. There's been some good, some bad with NWSL kits. I thought San Diego Wave kit was boring, but fine. And that's where you kind of draw the line. I talked about this on the TikTok page the other day. It's like, you either go boring and fine, but risk losing attention, and is anyone going to buy this boring jersey kit that's similar to the kit you had last year? And then you also, if you try to be more bold, you either get what Angel City, what Louisville has done in their gorgeous kits in the past, or you get what the Portland Thorns have done this year. Now, this is the replica kit, so the real kit probably has more going on sublimation-wise in the interior of the jersey, but if you picture a 2006-2007 era tap-out Affliction shirt, that's essentially what you're getting with this Portland Thorns kit. It drives an F-250 and complains about downtown traffic, and while you have to give them credit for going out of the box a bit, it's so busy with like the rose thorn aesthetic. They didn't give the sponsor, and this is something that I wish all kits would do, is they don't give the sponsor logo time to breathe, so everything's just kind of like crunched in there. I do like how they use the Nike template, though. I think that was smart. You saw that with the San Diego Wave kit, that they didn't necessarily, it just looks like another Nike template kit. It's obviously the template, but they worked that into the design, which I think is smart. I thought that was a very cool design choice. The rest of it, it's very divisive, let's just say. Every time I look at this, I think I find more things to just be utterly entranced by. For me, I like how they worked in the Thorns logo to the dagger in the middle. But the amount of words on this kit, it's not, I don't think that's going to read well when it's on a player in motion. But with all kits, you should really reserve judgment until you see them in motion. I'm wearing the St. Louis City kit. I had my apprehensions about it. We talked about that on the STL pod, but seeing them in motion, I think they look pretty darn good. I don't know if you're going to be able to say this about the Portland Thorns kit that has roses as the shoulder patches that kind of run into the TikTok logo on the sleeve. So, oh boy. I don't think that's going to age well. I think you're going to look back at that kit wondering what in the hell was Portland doing. Okay. So staying on the NWSL, the Utah Royals are back. Sportico broke the news today. An open secret. Real Salt Lake announced that ahead of their game tomorrow that they would have a press conference and it was pretty much heavily hinted that it was talking about the return of the Utah Royals. They NWSL all but confirmed it in the offseason, and Sportico has the details on the ownership. Kraft Analytics Group CEO Jessica Gelman and Philadelphia 76ers exec David Morey are going to be Daryl Morey, of course. Daryl Morey are going to be the group that brings the Utah Royals back. And it's an interesting group. I think it's they recently bought into RSL as well, so you get the idea, you get the sense anyway that this was them buying into a minority share of RSL to influence their way into the Utah Royals ownership as well. So I think that is cool. I think that seems like a good ownership group. They're going to be sponsored by America First Credit Union, which is interesting. Say what you will about Utah and the Royals. They had great fanship, they had great support, and they frankly didn't deserve to lose their team last time. The Utah Royals that moved to Kansas City were solely moved because Deloy Hansen was a sexist, racist piece of shit, and they shouldn't have lost that team. They did. They get a really good deal on getting this team back as far as ownership buying in, but I think NWSL wants to be in that market. They're supported well in that market, and it does kind of go against what Jessica Beeman said in terms of finding markets that are going to support bodily autonomy and are going to be good for the sake of the health of the athletes. Utah has a lot of issues, but I'm saying that, speaking to you here from Kansas City, Missouri, that has many of those same issues, if not worse, here in the Missouri legislature. So I don't necessarily want to hold that against them, but it is interesting that it seems like that statement was said and then completely disregarded. So it's good to have the Royals back. I think it'll be interesting to see how NWSL breaks things up. So Boston not coming in same year as Utah, but coming in the next year, assuming they can find a stadium site, which I think sounds like they have. They're also talking to a Bay Area group. So you're going to maybe have a situation where it's time to break the league up into conferences, maybe just with how much that travel is going to be. And then you get into the scenario we always get in when we talk about MLS conferences. It's like, where do you draw the line? And Kansas City is in an interesting spot with that, especially since Chicago has kind of been their main rival along with Houston. And where do you draw that line for those two teams? So some food for thought there, and something that's not a pressing matter at all, but something to think about, to ruminate on, if you will. All right, let's move on from the NWSL. Of course, before we move on completely, would be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the preseason action. Angel City hosting Club America in LA, and they end up winning. Alyssa Thompson gets her first goal on a pretty amazing little bit of acceleration, dribbling through 4 America defenders. And on the flip side, North Carolina went to Monterrey to play Monterrey in a preseason game and got spanked. That team has a lot to figure out. That is going to be a long season for them. And while a lot of people liked the Fox trade, I don't think that that's the spot that really makes a difference for them. I don't know. I thought that Pickett was a very creative player, and it gives you a lot of what Fox does. Fox is obviously stronger defensively and a better player overall, but I don't think that Carson Pickett is so much of a downgrade that that's the trade that you make to reset that roster, especially after losing Dabina, after losing Diana Ordonez. They're in for a rough season, I feel like, and the decisions made tactically to face Hiatus last night don't fill me with a lot of confidence of that team going forward. So, speaking of confidence, the teams going forward, Rochester, formerly the Rochester Rhinos, wrong zoological animal, Justin, of the 1999 U.S. Open Cup fame, of the almost an MLS team in 2007 fame, are on hiatus yet again. the news from Gustavo Lopez says, breaking news, the agreement between Rochester New York FC and the investor fell through last night, and the professional club is expected to go on hiatus during 2023 with a high possibility of being something permanent. The club is planning a statement to be published later today. Academies and youth teams are expected to continue throughout the year. And that's such a story of lower league soccer in America. So much of lower league soccer diaspora is centered around pro rel. And while, yes, that if it was a healthy pyramid from top to bottom, a team like the Rochester Rhinos wouldn't be constantly falling through the cracks. But the issue with that is that there are minor leagues, there are lower leagues that Rochester has been a part of, with USL, for instance, that do have a healthy league structure. And they brought in investors in 2017, Jamie Vardy included in those investors, and they completely changed the Rochester Rhinos brand, which was a major swing and a miss. Rochester Rhinos are one of those clubs like the New York Cosmos that just have that like gravitas that not many non-MLS and not many MLS clubs have. When you talk about just soccer in America, Rochester Rhinos are one of those legacy brands, and them moving away from that, coupled with that hiatus they took in 2017, coupled with their move away from USL last year, joining MLS Next Pro as Rochester, New York, with a very sanitized, it looked like this was a new team for MLS Next Pro. It didn't look like this was the heritage of the Rochester Rhinos. That was a bad look. And they made the playoffs. They've always been a competitive team, no matter what league they're in. But the fact that they've always been kind of nomads both speaks to the difficulties of the U.S. system, as well as just being poorly run. When you don't have this financial freefall of, say what you will about MLS, it's stable now. It wasn't that way for a long time, but now it is. And lower leagues are kind of running into that same issue. And if you're an independent team, you look at Detroit City, who tried to be independent for as long as they could. They had to join. They didn't have to join, but they joined USL this year. And there's a lot of pros and cons, but one of the pros is definitely financial stability and just knowing where your money is coming from. It's so important. And if you have investors that are looking to invest and you can't necessarily point to these revenues are absolutely happening, that's an issue. That's an issue for investors. And then you have a club with such local history and intrigue just folding up shop, going on hiatus without any follow-up. And so many clubs throughout this country have gone away that way. I mean, look at any professional club before MLS outside of Seattle Sounders, Portland Thorns, Vancouver Whitecaps, San Jose Earthquakes. You can't talk about U.S. soccer and talk about the lower leagues and talk about MLS and all the baggage that comes with that without understanding that there are pros and cons to everything, and understanding that pro rel probably not happening in this country unless a lot of people are okay with losing a lot of money. Like with expansion fees going up to $400 million in order to open that system up, you're going to have owners have, they're going to have to get a payout. There's going to have to be some financial incentive. And right now there just isn't. So MLS is going to add more teams. And if that eventually becomes an MLS 1 and 2 with like mini promotion relegation, there's going to have to be some compensation for these owners that are buying in at such ridiculously high prices that could more easily go to Europe and buy a team at cheaper rate. And that's kind of what you're looking at with Rochester too. Trouble with finding investors is a Rob McElhenney can go and invest in Wrexham in England with the hopes of eventually getting into the league, eventually getting into the Premier League down the line, and those upward and downward trajectories. If you're taking over Rochester, there is no movement there. You're just taking over a team. This is the league that they're in, and there's no real movement upwards without just growing the brand organically. But you're not going to get that. there's no movement to MLS. There's no movement to a higher league. And I think that inherently, outside of the local connection, becomes an issue for investors specifically. For local grassroots soccer, you can have a soccer club play anywhere as long as they are of the community, they're going to be successful. That's what so many people don't understand, is that there could be a soccer team in a closed system that only plays barnstorming games if they have this intense local connection, like with what you see in Detroit. That's going to be a successful team. But when you're looking at investors, when you're trying to put together a more bright club, a shinier club, a shinier toy, that doesn't happen without investors. Stadiums are expensive. There's a lot of baggage there, of course. But it's sad. As a U.S. soccer historian, it's something that happens all too often where these teams spend themselves into a corner, think that they get some bad advice, or, they're really just banking on an investor. And if that investor falls through, then what's next? Do I go back to being an MLS Next Pro team? Do I try to find a league somewhere? Will USL take me back? Will NISA pick up for the 12,000th time? It's hard. It's hard to be a lower league team. It's hard to be an MLS team, and hard enough to break into your local market, and then to be a lower league team as well. Try to find something that is sustainable. Luckily, USL seems to be moving that way in terms of being a successful lower league, in terms of having a pyramid, a mini pyramid, and then you also have leagues like the WPSL, like the UWS, that are trying to do it as well. But it all comes with issues, especially if you're trying to put together a professional team. There just aren't a ton of avenues for that. I talked about that a bit with some of my articles that I write when I was writing about how players from the UWS oftentimes have to go to Europe in order to receive a professional contract. That's on the women's side. The women's side is even more constricted than the men's side in terms of opportunities. But we'll end it there in terms of the Rochester, New York hiatus. It's just a sad thing to talk about when you're someone who reads, writes, and talks about the U.S. soccer pyramid so often. That's a historical team that is going to be just not an entity anymore. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk a bit CONCACAF Champions League. There's a little bit more to talk about here. Let's just run through these games a bit, because I think there are some interesting matchups here that are not necessarily being talked about as much as like what happened on match day. So first off, first game of the CONCACAF Champions League season sees Violet AC upset Austin 3-0. And this is one of those games that everything that could possibly go wrong for Austin went wrong. I mean, it's a relatively rotated roster, but you still have some starters in there. Stuver started, Fagundes started, Uriti started, and Austin has a problem with depth. I think that much is for sure, especially at the center back position, which, as you know, is so important, especially in any league, but especially in a team that plays like Austin do. And they ran into major difficulties. So, of course, Austin had that disaster, calamitous giveaway by Kip Keller a few weeks ago when they played St. Louis in the opener. And you think, okay, if that's the worst things are going to get defensively, we'll be all right. But things got so much worse in this game, especially in the context that Violet hadn't played a game in over 260 days since they won the CONCACAF Caribbean Championships, the Flow Championships. They hadn't played another game. They're playing this game in the Dominican Republic because conditions back in Haiti were deemed too dangerous to play. So they're not even playing on their home field. These are semi-professional players that up until yesterday have been trying since October to get visas for the return trip to Austin. In the context of this game, that's everything that is up against them, coming against a Austin team that is worth so much more from a player value standpoint, an Austin team that has started their season, that has played 3 competitive games up to this point. 2 competitive games up to this point, plus an entire preseason, and again, a much larger roster of players. However, what I do know is if you go back, you watch some Violet games from the Caribbean Championships, you see that they are very strong at fullback and very strong at striker. Michel Nadir Sherry scored 2 goals in this game. He scored a bunch of goals in the Caribbean Championships as well from this same style of setup where someone like Pierre goes down the left side, there's an interchange, maybe he just takes it himself. He sends in a cross. Sherry is able to just rise up because he's a very physical striker that knows how to use his height, his size, and dunks it in for a goal. That happened twice in this game. And I don't know if it's Austin just not being prepared, if it's Austin coming into this game thinking they can just walk away against this semi-professional Haitian squad with 3 points. But clearly, Austin were not there to play. They don't have the depth to be that confident going into a game against a team that they don't know much about, which I think works in Violet's favor, obviously, that there isn't a ton of game film on them. But it's also a team that hadn't played in 260 days. That definitely works against you more than it works for you. It was a great game plan from Violet, who clearly watched some early season MLS games and saw that teams can be successful out wide against the squad with kind of how narrowly they were playing this game. And defensively, they were not good. Nick Luma wasn't good, and Amro Tarek had what is a golazo of an own goal. If you watch this clip, Stuver makes a decent save. He parries it off to Tariq, who I guess is trying to clear it, but ends up kind of slipping and just going top corner into his own net. It's such an impressive own goal that it's really hard. Every time I watch it, I'm just like in awe of what just transpired. Not a great day for Tariq. Not a great day for Austin in general, who now are going to have to go home on tired legs again. And they're down 3-0. Now, as I talked about before we got into this game, Violet AC had issues getting their visa. There's a lot of reasons for that. One being that they are a semi-pro outfit, so some of their players had visas, some of them didn't. There's also the delicate issue of Haitian-American relations, which if you have studied history at all in any way, you know that it is not great. And this is one that Calvary, if you remember last year, Calvary AC had a forfeit against New York City FC because they weren't able to get visas in time. Same deal here, although it does sound like CONCACAF were able to help, which is good because it would be tragic if they'd pull off this upset and not be able to follow it up with the away leg and potentially get into the round of 8. And while the talent gap between Austin and Violet is still, perceived to be very large, if this is another Austin game where they're not playing their starters necessarily, this is a Sebastian Druzy-less Austin team. That's a guy that covers up a lot of cracks. And this team was not good during this game. So I don't know. I'm kind of thinking that, especially of Violet that comes in and plays very compact in between the lines. Like the only time that Austin has scored at all this year is in that St. Louis game where they scored twice. And that's because that's a very wide open, St. Louis does not play compact at all. If there's one thing they aren't, it's compact. And it allows for a lot of back and forth, which is how they want to play. And Austin can play that way too, especially when you give Sebastian Druzy time and space. But if you take away that time and space, and if you're not even trying to score, like Violet could just come in and park the bus, 3 goals is a lot to get back. So that'll be incredibly interesting to watch next Tuesday. But let's move on to the rest of the games here. Game number 2, of course, was Philadelphia drawing Alianza with a homegrown heavy roster that I thought was really, really cool. This is something I really liked out of Philadelphia that, especially with the team that puts a lot of emphasis on their homegrown players, it's an opportunity to give those players a match at, a relatively high impact, a relatively high profile in the CONCACAF Champions League. But, still, if you lose this game, it's not the end of the world. It's not necessarily, a 100% you're not going up against an LAFC where they're going to be pressured into those kind of mistakes necessarily. And it's a game on the road at Alianza that I think doesn't have a ton of eyes on it from the domestic standpoint as well. It's a good opportunity to play those kids in meaningful minutes. So that ends up with a 0-0 tie, and you saw some good performances, and especially out of kind of Jack Elliott, I thought was very good for them. And the main star of this is in the 67th minute. A dog comes onto the pitch. It's a dead ball. Everyone just kind of standing looking around, and here out of the corner of the screen you see this dog just like darting for the ball. He gets it, he plays with the ball, he's such a good boy, and then gets carried off, and he's just smiling and looking like he accomplished his mission, which that's a good boy, and I'm happy that he was able to get the ball. That's the main thing of this game, is that Philadelphia goes back home, gonna host Alianza, and it's 0-0, so that's still looking up for them for sure. Next up on the night was Orlando City drawing Tigres. This is another game that I thought the MLS team came out on top. You know, Tigres at home, that's a tough game for most MLS sides. So Orlando City on the road, go into Mexico, come out with a draw, and really frustrated Tigres too. Like, that's what you really take away from this game, is even though Orlando don't really generate anything themselves, they definitely came into this with we're going to sit behind the ball, we're going to let you come at us. If we have an opportunity, we're going to spread things out. You can tell that in the passes. Tigres had 444 accurate passes to Orlando's 256, and Orlando didn't have anything that constituted a big chance. Tigres had 2. And that comes down to just Orlando doing a great job packing things in, not letting Tigres get the most of those big chances, and Pedro Gallese coming up big like he does so often. And Orlando City get the draw. Now they get to go to Orlando, where they play very well, and they have such a home environment there with a 0-0 scoreline, and that looks up for them. Now, if they do try to open things up a bit more, play like they happened in MLS against this Tigres side, then that's a much more interesting game, and a game where maybe they play like that for one half and open things up for the second when you're going for that goal, because they need to score to move on, obviously. There's a lot of, tactics-wise, knowing that both teams need a goal, I think that Orlando can also kind of prey on Tigres' need for a goal, their desperation, and Oscar Pereira could design a masterclass. So that'll be something to pay attention to next week. And a game that I kind of feel confident in Orlando City. Other years I wouldn't, but this Orlando team is good. There's a lot of quality in that team. Playing at home, playing against a Tigre side who's going to be desperate. I think that's a lot of things in their favor. So, moving through, Tyro FC lose 1-0 to Leon. CD Olympia beat Atlas 4-1, which was a bit of a shocker as well. Olympia are definitely overachievers. They won the CONCACAF Champions, or the CONCACAF League, not the Champions League, but the league, to earn their berth into the Champions League. They did not lose a single game last season, and they were knocked out of the Champions League the year prior via a 2-2 draw to America, where they lost on away goals. So they're a team that routinely punches above its perceived weight. I think they're actually a pretty good squad that just get underrated because of the league that they come from. Moving on to the final 8, probably. Next up, Vancouver Whitecaps beat Real España 5-0. This is a bit of a rout in Vancouver, which Vancouver, something you would not expect out of that team with how they looked in the past year and a half outside of Canadian tournament games. But España going into Vancouver, complaining about it being cold. The roof was closed. That's interesting. I don't know. I don't buy into those complaints, although a 15-hour plane trip is a lot. Moving on to the final rounds of match day 1. City and Montoya drew Pachuca 0-0, and Alajuelense lost LAFC 3-0 in a game that I thought LAFC looked very good in. Talk about that for a second. Denis Buonga scores a hat trick in the second half and is really starting to look like a player that LAFC can rely on. Taking that step, not that he was a player that they couldn't before, but taking that next step to like MVP Carlos Vela levels as Vela takes a step back, as he gets into this contract as well. And that's LAFC have done a good job betting on those type of players, and this is another one that looks like he's going to come good for them. And honestly, this was a pretty perfect game for LAFC. There's not a lot that went against them here. Alajuelense did a good job in the first half, limiting LAFC's chances. LAFC couldn't necessarily figure them out from a goal standpoint, but also just from a cohesive play standpoint. They just couldn't get anything going as far as long-term pressure. But one thing I do love about LAFC is I was watching this game last night. They have these instances where they're kind of frustrated, where they can't break through. Then they just one-touch it all the way down the field, and it's some of the most beautiful soccer you'll ever watch, and they can just pull that out with the talent that they have on this team. So I think that they should be going all in on CONCACAF Champions League this year just to get that out of the way. Not that they don't want to win MLS Cup again, but you kind of have to do one or the other. You saw that with Seattle last year, just with the depth of MLS teams with the roster constraints. Now, maybe that's different with the month-long potential break with Leagues Cup, although LAFC probably don't get that break unless they play a rotated squad for that tournament, which is kind of the point of the month-long break. But it'll be interesting to see how that impacts it, because in the past, teams that have went heavy on CONCACAF Champions League have come out the other side pretty worse for the wear. It happens without fail every time. You saw that with Toronto, you saw that with Seattle, and it's just a lot of games to play in a short amount of time, and you just burn players out. And in Seattle's case, Toronto recovered a bit. Seattle didn't recover at all last year and have looked significantly better this season, which tells you that a lot of that was the just general fatigue from that tournament last year. So LAFC make that choice. They did go a little bit easy with Carlos Vela coming off in the 68th minute of this match. But again, they probably could have won. We'll see on the return leg what this looks like. The home game at LAFC, you're up 3 goals already. Is that a rotated squad they play, or do they continue just putting their best foot forward? So that's enough CONCACAF Champions League for this week. Of course, you have the return games next week, and paying attention to that Austin game, man. So that's going to be one where Austin are going to be firing. They're going to open that thing up, and Violette are going to be hunkered down. So that's a must-watch for me for sure. Let's go into looking at some of the MLS fixtures from this upcoming week. Some good games, of course. St. Louis going on the road to Portland for the first time after going up, being 2-0. Who could have seen that coming? Not I. Not I, a guy who covers the team even. That's an interesting one for me because I think Portland gives them a lot of matchup issues that Charlotte and Austin don't. And you're going to start playing these teams that, while Austin had Sebastian Drusi, they had areas that St. Louis are strong in that they could exploit. And the play of St. Louis's center backs makes me nervous for a Portland squad that started to show some signs in the second half of last week's game with Evander finally scoring and looking good. Charlotte play Atlanta in that. Is that a derby? I think of that as a derby, Charlotte and Atlanta, but if you're a Charlotte or Atlanta fan, tell me that I'm wrong. I know Atlanta in Orlando. I know Atlanta in Nashville. Charlotte just feels right, too. That'll be an interesting game. Charlotte are in a rough spot after their loss to St. Louis last week. That's a team that needs to figure some stuff out, and Atlanta could make them pay for that. So Charlotte lose to New England. They lose to St. Louis City 3-1. I didn't think they looked particularly dangerous. They had that one goal, but that was more of a center back mix up than that kind of came against the run of play. Like St. Louis kind of dominated Charlotte in that game. Atlanta had the win over San Jose, which San Jose is a quality team this year, it looks like, and the 1-1 draw over Toronto, which say what you want about Toronto. So Atlanta have yet to lose, Charlotte have yet to win. Something's got to give. Last year's matchup, it was 1 win, 1 loss. So that'll be fun to pay attention to. Vancouver takes on FC Dallas. DC United take on Orlando. That should be a pretty good one for Orlando to kind of bounce back after what we talked about with the Tigres game, where it was very much the opposite of anything attacking. Cincinnati and Seattle, this is probably one of the must-watch games of this week. Choose between that and New York and Inter Miami. Those are two matchups that Cincinnati and Seattle, you knew coming into the season that those would be two good teams. Seattle is undefeated and have looked just phenomenal through 2 games. New York and Inter Miami. New York are starting to figure things out, it looks like. They're starting to get some signings in that they desperately needed. They're still missing some pieces, of course. Still missing that starting striker, of course. But they drew the fire last week. Got a goal. And Inter Miami are 2-0 with 2-0 wins over Montreal and a 2-0 win over Philadelphia. And Miami, if they come into this game in New York and come out with a win or even a draw, I think that is a statement of intent for this team that many had written off before the season. And looking at their roster, you'd write them off as well. Union and the Fire. Toronto against Columbus. That has a lot of tasty undertones to it. Toronto, if they could win over Columbus, finally get their season off on the right foot. But Columbus had a great win over DC United last week. Not a good game against Philadelphia, but you know this team is going to be strong. They have a new manager, so it's going to take some weeks to really look good. Minnesota and New York Red Bulls. It's a game I am very much not necessarily interested in. Nashville and Montreal. I think Nashville, with how they've looked, that's a game that they're going to want to win. Sporting Kansas City against LA Galaxy. The Sporting KC's home opener. They are dedicating the press box to Grant Wall in this game, which I think is important to note and maybe makes it a little more emotional of an opener than usual. Sporting play well at home. The Galaxy are going to want to get off on the right foot after their loss to Dallas last week. And frankly, if you're the LA Galaxy and you're 2 losses to start the season, and probably lucky that's not 3 because you didn't play the opening game against LAFC, that's putting yourself behind the 8 ball for sure. So it's the second game of the season, but that's already some great importance after losing the opener. Real Salt Lake and Austin FC. I think this will be a fun game, actually. So Salt Lake beat Vancouver. They lose to Seattle, but everyone's going to lose to Seattle this year. And then Austin, we talked about, they beat Montreal 1-0, but Montreal's not a good team. They lost to St. Louis in their first ever game, and they lost to Violette. So Austin need a result that is encouraging for this team. If they lose, they're going into that home game against Violette just in shambles. Not a great start for them. Of course, Portland against St. Louis City. Talked about this a little bit earlier. Bradley Carnell said in his kind of game notes with the media today that there isn't really a preferred starting 11. They've been training with 23 players since preseason, and there's competition for places. And I think that's important with this team because a lot of talk in the national media has been about the lack of star power, and there's definitely a lack of star power in this team. But their DPs have hit. Edouard Lewin has been fantastic. Xiao Klaus, I wrote about in St. Louis City Magazine this week, has just been the best version of himself, and they're getting the most out of him through 2 games. Does that continue the rest of the season? There's no way of knowing, but he played well at Lask when they played in a similar setup in Austria, and I think Carnell knows how to get the most out of such a unorthodox number 9, and I think that's part of it too. So maybe things towards the end of the season, when they have more game tape to look at these players, things don't go as well. But I think you have to talk about Bradley Cardinale just getting the most out of these players, and Nicolas Gioacchini, Indiana Vasilov. Those are two players that have kind of been reclamation projects, and Gioacchini has looked phenomenal through these 2 games and is kind of my unsung hero of this team. Jabu Leblanc definitely took a step forward last week in terms of his getting into the system and getting ready. Another game under his belt, another week of training under his belt. So it'll be interesting. Portland, they beat Sporting Kansas City. I don't think Sporting Kansas City are good with where they are right now, especially with all their injuries. They only beat them 1-0. They lose to LAFC 3-2, but LAFC definitely let their foot off the gas. They won up 3-0 in the first half. Although, if you look at this, I watched this game earlier today. Portland, in the second half, were able to really, really become productive. Of course, if you look at their XG, they still only contributed 0.85 XG in that second half. But you finally get a goal from a vendor that you've been waiting for since he came in. You got good play from your best players, right? Starting to anyway. So if you look at Vander's chart from this game, takes 4 shots, 84% passing, chance created, 0.28 expected goals, 1.11 expected goals contributed. That's a good game from a guy that you need to be really good this season if you're Portland. So if you're St. Louis, you look at a guy like Evander, you look at, how rough their center back situation is with Hebert and Tim Parker, with Joakim Nilsson still out for a while. That gives you some pause, I think. That being said, they should be able to score on this team. LAFC just kind of ran through them in the first half, and if you go up to 3-0 lead, then a lot's going to go your way. So that's a very interesting game that, as a St. Louis writer, I'm a little bit worried about. But I see ways through for that team with how they've been playing and with how they're going to play. And then finally, San Jose Earthquakes, Colorado Rapids. You know them, you love them. The Rapids played to a 0-0 draw against SKC last week, which I didn't talk about with Sporting KC earlier, which was probably the most boring game. Well, that's not true. One of the most boring games I've watched this month. Tottenham played Wolves last week in what was just a disaster of a game. That may have been more boring, but this one didn't even have any goals in it. So I don't know. The Rapids are not a good team. They lost 4-0 to Seattle in that first week, and they had nothing going for them. So this should be an easy San Jose win. It's at home in San Jose. San Jose beat Vancouver 2-1, and Vancouver, I think, are better than we have made them out to be. And they lost to Atlanta United to 2 stoppage time goals from Thiago Almada. So San Jose, I like what they're doing this year. I think they're on the right track. They should run over this Colorado team. And if you're looking for an exciting game to watch, obviously at the same time, Portland and St. Louis is going to be exciting too. But watch what Cade Cowell can do against this Rapids defense, I think should be one to watch for. All right, folks. Thank you so much for listening to today's Talkin' Soccer. I, of course, have been your host, Justin Horniger. If you're watching this on YouTube, give me a like, give me a subscribe. It helps me out so much. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast player, give me a thumbs up and a rating. It can be a 1-star rating. I don't care. Give me a rating in whatever the app of choice is. They are going to help me in the charts because that's how that works. Anyway, hope you're all having a great end of your week. On to a great weekend of football, a great weekend of soccer, and we'll talk very soon.